we are recording, and I'm lucky enough to have Professor Ken Strain and Tucker Goodrich back with me. Professor Strain is an experimental physicist, a fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh and the Institute of Physics, and is the Deputy Director of the Institute for Gravitational Research at the University of Glasgow here in Scotland. And he was part of the international collaboration that successfully discovered gravitational waves. And on the side, there's a large interest in nutrition science. Welcome.
Hi, Ali.
And Tucker Goodrich, who has been on the podcast a couple of times before and is a Wall Street risk specialist and tech guru who has spent his career analysing and creating complex systems to minimise risk and fix failure. Welcome back.
Ali, Ken, great to see you guys.
Good to see you, Tucker, too.
Good to see you both. So you've both been quite outspoken throughout the COVID coverage, as you're both keen to follow the data wherever that takes you. And it often doesn't take you the same way as the newspapers and politicians have gone. We're going to try to cover a few different things from the lockdown, mainly talking about the viral pathogen itself and how it moves around the population, and how nutrition ultimately can help in mitigating that. But maybe we can start just by giving a kind of summary of what's happened in the last 2 to 3 months. Both of you came on the podcast a couple of months ago. So how would you characterize what's happened with COVID, Tucker?
Life turned upside down and sideways. I was under quarantine here for 4 weeks with my girlfriend, who's a nurse, who was works in an orthopedic surgery hospital. And they shut down everything and put her in the COVID triage business. She promptly came down with symptoms and went on quarantine along with her boss and a bunch of her other colleagues. So I made the decision to go into quarantine with her. I wasn't and aren't all that concerned about the effect of this particular virus on me because I'm pretty healthy and I think I'm doing all the right things that one ought to be doing. But it was pretty nerve-wracking being stuck in this room for 4 weeks. She finally cleared symptoms and could go back to work, and couldn't really see anybody. It's different. And of course, my work has shut down here, and so it's just been trying to figure out what's going on the internet and trying to do a lot of walks and avoid going crazy. Hopefully I've succeeded.
And Ken, how would you summarize the last 2 or 3 months?
Okay, so when I was on last time, I had just had COVID in the previous few weeks, or at least I was fairly sure I had, and I'm much more sure now since I've spoken with quite a wide range of people. And it seems that, unlike we were told back in February, March, that the symptoms were, harsh hacking cough and fever and so on, and neither of which I had much of at all. It actually, I think that the classic symptom for people who get it is this period of breathlessness, which in my case was fairly mild, but noticeable if I did much exercise, that I was a little bit out of breath, my heart rate was a little bit high. And then it just went away the way of these things, and had a very busy period of work from home, during which I was watching out onto the world and seeing crazy situation unfold where almost everything that I heard being said that I could think of a way of testing wasn't right. Or was misleading or confused or unclear, and this is from government, it's from the mainstream media, it's from just just what people were saying out on social media, that I don't think I've ever experienced a situation in which such a high percentage of what I was hearing was really not making much sense at all. Apart from a few islands of sanity like Tucker and others out in the world. And I actually found that was very stressful. I hadn't realized how stressful, but just, you begin to maybe doubt yourself a little bit, and going over things time and time and shaking. No, you're not thinking wrongly. You are thinking clearly. The numbers do make sense. And then in the last few weeks, through a few different routes, there's been some emerging, more like a consensus. So, for example, on Ivor Cummins' podcast, for example, there's been a series of informative topics and videos that I would have agreed with, and also a lot of people exchanged information sources so that we could learn the best way to get data efficiently. So, for example, I looked at some Swedish counties data and data in deaths in England and elsewhere in the UK, and so on, and being able to be part of a growing group of people who were looking into the data and learning the meaning and seeing what was going on, I found was quite helpful, because making your way on your own would have been a long and slow process. And then I think the happiest part of it is, obviously I'm Eurocentric to some extent. The US is big and complicated. Europe is smaller and a bit simpler. And so I've been looking very frequently at the Euromomo website with its graphs of mortality, which I think is very accurately presented. And if you look there now and you look at the whole of Europe, you see very good news that the rate of deaths is back to the expected level for this time of year, just in the last couple of weeks. That has been the case. And if you look more closely, you see that really, apart from a mild excess in Scotland and a still relatively substantial excess in England, and a couple of smaller excesses in Sweden and Belgium as well, the continent is back to health normality, which has got to be good news. Given that all those different countries had their own build-up of the disease, their own weather conditions, their own population health, care home arrangements, and all of those factors differed from country to country, and yet almost all of them have come to a good outcome in the last couple of weeks, if not earlier.
Yeah, that's definitely a plus, and it's something that I've kind of been trying to point out to people for some time, is that we're doubly shooting ourselves in the foot by being really negative about the potential course of the disease by listening to models around catastrophic infection and fatality rates like Neil Ferguson's from Imperial College. And people still are haunted by that and still think that that's why we're doing all this, and it's on track. And if people leave lockdown too soon, and there'll be a big second surge. So they're feeling very negative because of that. But also, what's kind of lost my train of thought a little bit. But what I was going to say about the sort of my personal summary is that it chimes very much with yours, Ken, in that I didn't realize how depressed I would be by the fact that people aren't really interested in following the data. So when it comes to nutrition, I'm at peace with it. Basically, 99.9% at least of people are never going to read a scientific paper, and that's fine. I'm not berating them for that. To some people, it's incomprehensible or boring or both or something else, and that's fine. But what's amazed me is that even the people who read scientific papers for a living sometimes are impervious to to me, fairly obvious conclusions if you spend a few hours looking at these graphs. And, I actually feel calm looking at data. I think that's not that common, to want to dive in to understand the data in order to feel more at ease because you understand what the truth is. That's how I'm motivated. And it's led me to asking you both back on the podcast because I really wanted a conversation with people who were doing the same thing and not another conversation with someone who had become afraid and felt backed into a corner, not just because they feel like by encouraging lockdown, they're hedging their bets, that's safer for them and their loved ones, which is an understandable position if you're not into reading the data, but also because they've been in favor of lockdown for a couple of months now. So if they go back on that, then they look silly personally.
Mm-hmm. The thing that I really can't understand that seems to be a very rare thought, and it was my very first thought, that if people were crazy enough to try this lockdown thing, then the damage would be much worse from the lockdown than from COVID. And that was almost instinctive. It was just, you can't shut down a country. Like I was trying to come up with a number for how much the UK has been shut down in the past to April, say, and my first idea was to look up our value-added tax receipts, and that I hadn't thought clearly because they'd gone down from 12 billion pounds last April to minus a billion. And that's because it's not sales tax, it's passed down the chain, and people can claim back, and so the refunds exceeded the taking. So that wasn't a good idea.
I'm guessing they never figured that was going to happen.
Negative VAT
tax.
Yeah, oops. Exactly. Oops. And it's a little bit more complicated than that because they gave a payment holiday for some businesses and so forth. So, so there are some receipts that are due later, but nonetheless, that's no way to measure the economy. The best I could come up with was looking at fuel duty. So in any gasoline or petrol or diesel, whatever, there's a percentage that goes to the government, and in April that halved compared to the April the year before, and I reckon that's a pretty good proxy for the state of the economy. And that's just horrendous. That to me, that's just completely horrendous. And so there's the economic cost, but I think that the personal cost that people must be storing up in the children who are not playing with other children and things like that must be absolutely enormous. And I think it may maybe take people years to recover, even if we stop now. And the thing that I just can't fathom is that almost nobody seems to think that way. Nearly everyone seems to think it's free of charge. Maybe we'll have to pay some money back later, but that's it. And I just don't understand that.
Yeah,
I'm not an economist, so I can't prove it, but
I liked what you said, how from a physicist point of view, it's not an elastic system. It's not like a perfectly bouncy ball that that'll give back the energy you put in. It's a dissipative system. It's like smoke in a room. You can't. It's like herding cats. You're not just going to see it bounce back.
Yeah, I think it's even worse than that because it's a particular type of dissipative system where it works on all different timescales. So a little bit will bounce back very quickly. People will reopen their businesses and people will bring back people who've been furloughed and so on and start settling things. And that bit will come back pretty fast. But that might only be a third or a quarter or a half or something. And then some of it will come back in a few weeks, and some of it will come back in a few months, but some of it will be a lifetime before the damage is gone because a whole new business is going to have to be built.
Yeah, so I can actually be an optimist here. one of the things that I was looking at and trying to understand what we're going through now was what happened obviously back in 1918, which was a far worse epidemic than what we're seeing currently, by I think any current expectation of how this is going to turn out. And couple of interesting things I saw in looking at that. The first was all of the economics people who are far more used to dealing with complicated models predicting organic systems, because of course the economy is an organic system, than the epidemiologists are, that this is what they do all the time. The first thing they all said was, of course, we can't rely on models because we know how notoriously unreliable they are, right? Which if you're on Wall Street or in risk management or you're an economist is your starting point. Okay, well, this model's cute, but it's bullshit on some level, right? The next thing that was really interesting was there was no statistics gathered in 1918 effectively. Most of that in the United States is done by the Federal Reserve Bank, which was one of the first organizations to do it, and they'd only just started up. So I found a paper from a Federal Reserve governor describing the economic impact of 1918, and basically what he did was go back through the Fed library archives and look at newspaper articles, right? They didn't have the total lockdown that we had, but they had lots of little local lockdowns, school shutdowns, some business shutdowns, but it varied widely from place to place. But they had business declining by 50% in a lot of areas, which is commensurate with what we're probably seeing now. But the most interesting thing about that is nobody remembers the Great Depression that started in 1918, right? The 1918 flu, which 50 million people around the world was followed by the Roaring 20s and a huge economic boom that lasted for, until 1929. So while it's very easy to see all the calamity that's taking place right now, and I think there's an enormous amount of calamity, more than we can measure or really understand at the moment, it is an incredibly dynamic system. And I think, what happened in 1918, what happened after World War II ended, when they basically, we'd been in a Great Depression since 1929 to 1945, and in 1945 they let go of the reins and said, okay, take off, and it took off. And, we saw a huge economic boom. But, to Ken's point, people were incredibly traumatized by what happened in both of those things, and that's not going to go away, even though we may see new industries rise up. And, I heard somebody say the other day that they thought 2/3 of the restaurants were going to go out of business. And, who knows? Those people aren't going away, the restaurateurs, and, they're all going to have to start up a new restaurant. So the industry will come back, but, your favorite restaurant may never come back. And, Lord knows, bigger industries that have been hugely impacted, that like the hotel business, the airline business, and the cruise ship business, who knows what that's going to look like coming out of this. It's,
Nightclubs, bars, who's going to be cheek by jowl at a bar now. But I like what you're saying, and I think it's definitely the right thing to be wary about falling into the trap of modelling disaster coming from this, when that's what got us into the mess of lockdown, arguably because of listening to a catastrophic model that turned out to not be true.
Well, it's just the economy. It's an organic system, and it's a growth system. So it's got an incredible ability, if you let it, to repair itself and to grow, right? That's what it's for, basically, if you want to look at it that way. It is a growth system.
It's been amazing seeing the ingenuity displayed by many people, restaurateurs and others who have been unable to trade normally, in the new constraints and finding a way to bring something that people want to them. You're going to say something, Ken?
I was actually going to change the subject, because it was just something you said, Ali, about the nightclubs and the cheek by jowl. And my reaction is that, well, people better if they want to be healthy, right? Because one of the most profound things about that seems to have caught the world of virology and epidemiology completely off guard, even though it's perfectly normal, is that we have immunity to this virus even before we have exposure to it, because we had exposure to other coronaviruses and other viruses. And if we start to live in a box and reduce human contact, then we'll lose in the end, because our immune systems will be that much weaker. We won't be training them up. I don't know enough about the particular type of immunity that's required here is T-cell immunity. But I know that it's absolutely critical in up to adolescence, because that's when your thymus gland is pumping out new T cells that are learning how to interact with the world and how to match as many different viral proteins as possible. And it's quite amazing, because I think a lot of people know about antibodies. Your immune system makes antibodies, learns about a virus or a bacterium or whatever, makes antibodies, and those antibodies then go on the outside of the virus and inhibit it. And your antibodies are there, if not for life, then for life, for life, for measles, for a year or two or three for a coronavirus. But antibodies could only match the surface of the virus, and the viruses are quite clever and they change the surfaces regularly, and that's why you catch flu time and time again, because the details on the surface don't match the antibodies after a while. But the T-cell immunity, which seems to have been so important in the suppression of the spread of SARS-CoV-2, is that can recognize any protein expressed by the virus while it's in your cells. So the virus goes into your cell and has to make a bucket load of different proteins to reproduce all the functions of the virus, to build new virus particles, and then to release them. And your cells diligently put copies of every viral protein that it's making, or little elements of it, on the surface, so that your immune system can see what your cells are doing and whether they've been hijacked by a virus. And it turns out that one of the most important structural virus factory proteins that needed to make the virus factory up and running in your cells is almost unchanged among all the coronaviruses. It's called ORF1, but it's almost unchanged. And it's likely that that's one of the ones that gives us immunity, because we've all had, there's a very good chance that we've all been exposed to coronaviruses. And so we've all got T cells that are primed to recognize this virus factory being implemented in our cells and go kill those cells.
That's one of the key observations that you're making, is that despite this being called a novel coronavirus, it is novel in the sense that the 2020 Ford Fiesta is novel. It may have some new bits of chrome on it, or blackout trim for you Europeans, I guess, and but it's still got an engine that's probably the same engine that's been in the Fiesta for the last 10 years, and it's got 4 wheels, and it's not novel in a meaningful sense. It's novel in the sense that it's slightly different and will show up slightly different on some of the assays that they use to detect viruses. And one of the things that's becoming more and more clear as you read more and more about the attempts to make a vaccine for this is how much existing immunity there is to this virus already. And they're just starting to figure it out. But if you start with the assumption that it's not novel in a meaningful sense, then that's exactly what you should expect, right? Everybody on the planet's been exposed to the coronavirus for most of their lives. This is not, this is not the Andromeda strain that came from another planet and
Yeah,
you know.
and it links to what we were talking about before. It's not so much of a change of subject. I think what we want to do is leave details about why perhaps lockdown wasn't necessary for longer than a week or two till the end of the podcast, which is fine. But the problem with talking about the downsides of lockdown is that you immediately draw equivalence between the downsides of lockdown and the upsides of lockdown. The idea that they're about the same, and that you're saving hundreds of thousands of lives through lockdown. Whereas what both of you really said when you came on a couple of months ago was all signs point to the epidemic having peaked in countries where it was allowed to get started. And so that was the phenomenon at the time. And I was convinced by the data. You both were convinced by the data. The question was, why did that happen? And it seems that this T-cell immunity is key in understanding that, because if about 50% of people have T-cell immunity to the point where they're not really ever going to get COVID symptoms meaningfully or become a vector, then your herd immunity strategy suddenly looks automatically the right choice.
It's even a little bit more than that, in that COVID doesn't seem to spread very effectively except under pretty specific circumstances. So you need a susceptible population. That's a population that's got a lot of people who are not that healthy, and so their innate immune system lets the virus through, and then they have symptoms, because asymptomatic people really don't spread very much at all. And there have been several studies of that now. There was a woman
at first it was really thought that they did, and that was what differentiated it from other respiratory illnesses.
There was a woman who was, I think, a 82-year-old woman who had asymptomatic for a few days and made 459 contacts, and no one caught it from her. And so there needs to have a healthy and unhealthy population to spread through. It needs to have the right weather. Now, it seems that temperate, so not too cold, not too hot, and a particular level of absolute humidity in the air is ideal. And all the cities that had really bad outbreaks had that kind of weather at the time of their outbreak. And then once it gets going, it spreads really quite fast through super spreading events. And you see that all over the place.
Astonishingly fast.
Really astonishingly fast.
Astonishingly fast. Once
and I think any talk of our numbers, whatever, is pretty much nonsensical, because it's the number of, it's the number of people from China who've arrived in Heathrow that tell you how many infections you have in London a few weeks later, because each of those seeds, dozens or hundreds of people, those super spread events. But then most of those people don't even spread it to other people in their household. It turns out that it spreads really slowly when it's in a community, and when the weather is maybe not perfect, and when it's spreading amongst working age people or younger, the rate of spread is very low. And I just checked up that the SAGE, the government advisory group in the UK, they had a meeting on the 31st of March, and they estimated the R value for the whole country to be about 0.6. And that's way but less than 1, and the virus is dying out if it's less than 1. And that was even including a fairly substantial amount of spread in hospitals, which is the main spread route, and care homes, which is the other main spread route and the one that it causes most damage in because of the age of the population. But it's very much a disease that you catch when you have a contact with a hospital, or have a contact with someone who has a contact with a hospital, but it's not so much a disease that you pick up just here and there, out and about. And in that sense, it's as Tucker said, it spread surprisingly fast for its point of view, the best circumstances, and then really very poorly the rest of the time. I'm not sure that's all that different from any other coronavirus, actually. And if you look at the, there was a study done in Glasgow way back 2005 to 13, where they managed to get serum from hundreds of patients going to hospital, and they tracked all the viruses they had. And what you see every spring is a pattern where there's a coronavirus. Roughly about a quarter of the patients arriving in the hospital have some kind of virus infection at the time. You know, Glasgow's a very good place for colds and flus. In the winter, it's wet and, you know, kind of miserable. And so there's typically at least 25%, up to 40%, or even more, of people with some sort of virus. And they typically have one virus, because having one virus ramps up your immune system, you tend not to get others. But just after the start of the year, about maybe a half or a bit less, a third of that third of the population, so 10% of the population is coronavirus, and it pretty much disappears by March, most years, sometimes April.
Although I had seen a paper that it's around at the same rate year round, it just goes asymptomatic in the off seasons, because coronaviruses clearly have a seasonal, all the existing ones have a seasonal profile.
We hear they're actually tracking the viral count, and it goes very, very low. I mean, it doesn't disappear in any month of the year, but in actually in the late summer, it's pretty much gone. It's low in the late summer, fall, and then it grows. And it seems to stay away from influenza A, and it doesn't. It's quite pally with influenza B. It's quite odd. So obviously there are things that they have in difference in common, that the body, when it's really fighting one, is better at keeping the other at bay. And, you know, I think if you say, so I would say a typical coronavirus would tend to disappear from the Glasgow population, or just strongly decrease in the Glasgow population in March, April. And of course, that's what this one's done too. So again, it's not quite clear how really novel it is in that respect. I mean, I'm not saying that it's the same as those.
That suggests we should expect a second wave.
It suggests that we should expect a second wave, although I wouldn't like to bet whether it would be this winter or 3 winters down the road, when people's immunity has dropped off a bit. The antibody immunity have dropped off, and it's back to the T cells again. But, you know, I don't know. Presumably the first time it happens is entirely determined by the injection of the virus into areas with the right weather. So Brazil, it's happening later. Here it happened, you know, in our spring. But once it settles into the population, it probably has to be driven by the normal seasonal factors that affect all the other viruses, and it finds its own niche in amongst the pattern. I hadn't really realised that you know, H1N1 flu is endemic in Glasgow now. It's been there for
and I expect this will also be endemic.
Yeah. Well, this is another real point of potential optimism, because besides the fact that it looks like it's dropping off hard in a seasonal way that you know, means that we're not going to see this second surge in the summer that all the papers and politicians are talking about, because they're not talking about a seasonal surge. They're talking about a summer surge because people are going back to the beach. And that's the first point of optimism. But the second point is we've got to a point of understanding of it now in terms of risk profile of the individuals who do worse from it, that we can start to, you know, talk about what to do to prevent ourselves being in those risk groups. And we've got real power there, I think, no matter what age you are, to take some control. And I wonder, like, in your dream table of risk factors, what would be like the 5 big ones that you think people could affect through lifestyle changes?
I think maybe we'll leave one of the risk factors aside for more in-depth discussion, maybe led by Tucker in a few minutes.
Consumption of linoleic acid.
Exactly.
Omega-6 fats.
Yeah. But I thought I think it's worth just mentioning that I tried to think through for a fairly complete list of what is it that makes you healthy, really? And to have a healthy immune system, there's certain proteins, certain enzymes that need to be working very effectively. I mean, I could mention some of the names, glutathione peroxidase in particular. And this is an enzyme that keeps your mitochondria healthy and free from reactive oxygen species when they're fighting hard, especially producing chemicals to clear viruses out and to kill cells. You want the viruses to be destroyed and your own cells to survive. And so you've got chemical enzyme like glutathione peroxidase, which uses the antioxidant, the main cellular antioxidant of glutathione to combat reactive oxygen species. And essentially, a healthy cell is one that's got a good ratio of the antioxidant effect to the reactive oxygen species. And so I thought, well, what are all the ingredients that you need in your diet to get that system maximized, to have as much of that antioxidant in your mitochondria powering your cells as possible? And there's a few kind of obvious ones. The element selenium, the metal selenium, which you get in Brazil nuts and organ meats in particular, because that's the main active atom in the middle of that molecule. But to get it there, you also need a whole host of particularly B vitamins, B6, B12, folate. And you need zinc because B6 and zinc always go together. And so you're starting to get a little family of nutrients that work together. And it turns out that to make this glutathione, you need to have a protein, an amino acid called cysteine. And it turns out to make that cysteine, recycle it from other chemicals, you need the B vitamins, folate and B12 and B6 and zinc. So it's exactly the same thing. And finally, to deploy all of these in the immune system, there's a huge amount of coordination goes on, operated by vitamin D and the activated vitamin D chemicals. So basically, vitamin D is a nuclear DNA programming chemical that mobilizes some substantial percentage of your genome, and so vast number of processes, including the preparation of the antioxidants for your mitochondria, need vitamin D to get working. Now that was a whole bunch of chemicals, but actually it turns out that meat and fish, that does it. Organ meats and fish, and you're fine. You don't need anything. You don't need anything else. You don't need to go and get any supplement unless you've got some metabolic problem or you've been deficient for many years. Or you might need vitamin B12, for example, if you've got stomach acid problems and can't absorb it very well. But unless you've got a condition like that, then basically just some fish, just some meat, any sort of seafood, any sort of meat, organ meats especially, you get plenty of selenium, and that's what you want to do. And then just to cap this off, this is a two-pronged thing with one little prong which I can deal with quickly and one enormous prong which we could talk about for hours. The little prong is that you can't utilize vitamin D and many of these other things if you've got metabolic syndrome, or if you've got metabolic disease, diabetes, or particular high blood insulin or high blood sugar. It really puts the spanner on the works. And so if you, even if you do have the good quality food like the fish and the meat and so on, if you're also eating a lot of carbohydrate and linoleic acid, seed oils, then you won't be able to run your body at near full efficiency, and so you won't be able to mount the defenses that you otherwise could. Okay, So, I mean, you know, and I think an emergency measure you might take if, you know, if you felt there was COVID coming down the street and it was coming to get you, is you might go very low carb very quickly, probably as low carb as possible. And that would probably be the best you could do in a kind of, you know, 1 or 2 week basis. You probably could make a difference in 1 or 2 weeks, but there's probably not much.
Which is the, as Dr. Trope pointed out to people who said that there's no dietary thing that you can do for COVID-19, every ICU in the country has a protocol where they want to control your blood sugar if you're in there on a pulmonary disease. So you're not even going out on a limb there medically.
No. That's
of course,
that's
a hospital won't have the good sense to say, "Oh, you've got a pulmonary disease. We should put you on a ketogenic diet and get your blood sugar under control."
And yet, you have people who are calling themselves evidence-based medical researchers who think we should, you know, not discourage eating donuts and that kind of thing because we don't want to attack people.
Yeah. Well, as I like to say, the first casualty of COVID-19 was evidence-based medicine. That clearly went right out the window as soon as folks started to panic about the apparent death rates. But we can get into that later on. One of the, you know, that's actually a really, it is the standard protocol for pulmonary disease to try and control hyperglycemia, with 2 of the major causes of pulmonary infections are, of course, influenza and coronavirus. Influenza, there's clear evidence that it depends on the glucose level in your cell to reproduce, to the extent where if they block glucose metabolism, they can block influenza spreading. And the level of glucose in your system controls how fast influenza can reproduce in your body. So I've looked, obviously I would, and I've not been able to find anything similar for coronavirus that it's as glucose dependent as influenza is. But, you know, given that it's the number 2 cause of viral pneumonia, you know, COVID-19 is not, but coronavirus in general is the number 2 cause of viral pneumonia in the world. It clearly seems like it would be the safest precaution you could take would be to go on a low carb diet.
Yeah, and that's kind of, I don't know, I suspected very quickly from looking at the data around COVID-19 in March that was a very sensible move. But of course, people are sick to death of hearing my recommendations to cut out seed oils, refined flour, and sugar where they can, progress, not perfection, and to include meat, fish, and eggs in their diet. And so when I come back and say, by the way, this new pandemic, you should just do what I've been telling you to do for ages, I kind of feel like the boy who cried wolf, even though there's been a wolf all along at every turn.
So I think that actually does bring up an interesting point, because I think another way in which this virus is not novel is in terms of who it kills. And I think we'll see there's very strong mechanistic reasons for that, and it's particularly people who have severe disease die in a particular not at all pleasant way. But if you look at either Euromomo, or it's exactly the same on the CDC data, I checked both. If you look at the age at which people die, let's say during any winter flu. So there was a moderate flu, not exceptional by any means, in Europe at the end of 2017, at the beginning of 2018. And then, of course, this year we've got the coronavirus. And if you break down the number of people who die by age, so for example, 45 to 65 or 65 to 75, etc., then you see that the people dying in excess of the number that you would expect in Europe of about 50,000 a week at the moment, have exactly, almost precisely the same age profile within a percent or so as the people who died in the excess in the winter of 2017-18. It really is remarkably close within a hair's breadth on the plots when you do them. And the difference is, though, the absolute numbers are obviously more. More people are dying at the moment than you would expect in a normal winter flu. There have been winter flus, many that have been much worse than this, but not for a few years. And in the normal winter flu, there might be in Europe a certain number of tens of thousands, 150,000 people, 140,000 people die over the winter in excess of what you would expect. Whereas for COVID in Europe, it's 171,000 at the moment. And so that's obviously worse. But if you look at it on the basis of how many weeks of flu would be equivalent to COVID, then it turns out to be about 1.5 flu seasons for even a relatively mild flu season. Okay, so we didn't have much of a flu season last year. And it looks like what's happened is that people have not died of flu last year. And then the people who might have died of flu, had there been a bad flu this year, are dying of COVID. And the people who made it through from last year, who are probably not, they're not very well on average. Healthy people tend to need to be over 90 to have a high risk of COVID, certainly in their high 80s into 90s if they're otherwise healthy. Whereas if you're metabolically unhealthy, if you're on a high carb diet with seed oils, then actually in 60s starts to become dangerous, and into 70s is dangerous. So there's something like a 10 to 20 year difference in your effective metabolic age. That's what you're telling people to do to grow up 20 years younger by following your diet recommendation.
And this is I'm also coming at it from another point of view where I would really like to give people I would like them to feel empowered to make an informed choice on risk, because ultimately that's what lockdown is removing from them. It's babying everyone. And I think it would be good for people to say, right, I want to go to the doctor and get these 5 tests. And okay, even in an ideal scenario, they'll fix their diet, but they 5, 6, however many tests, then they get the numbers back, and then they can have an accurate picture of the risk. And I've been talking to a couple of doctors, and, I've got a family member who's in their 70s, and I don't want them to get COVID if they're at risk of severe complications. So I suggested, after thinking about this, that maybe, HbA1c, kidney function, blood pressure, weight, BMI, liver function, fasting insulin, vitamin D level, maybe even C-reactive protein might be a good all-round list of numbers to get from the doctor, and to create a kind of risk profile so that they can decide.
It's a lot simpler than that. I can get you down to one number that you don't need to go to your doctor for. Your waist size.
Exactly.
What's your waist size compared to where you were when you were 18 years old?
Maybe. But you can get
that encapsulates everything you just described.
You can have people who are metabolically healthy and carry extra weight, right?
No, you really can't.
Yeah.
What you can have is people who don't have belly fat and are, what you call skinny fat or diabetic. That's definitely an issue. But for the average person, if they've got belly fat, that's the number one indicator that something's gone off the rails. And if you're fixing that, you're fixing everything else.
Yeah. So I was sorry.
No, I think it's Ted Nyman, who's a physician in this space, who finally came down to that's, you know, after trying to figure out what numbers to use, he was like, that's really the only number. You know, if that's going in the right direction, then everything else is going in the right direction. And if it's going in the wrong direction, so is everything else.
I think the problem is with the tests, Ali, that you need to get them interpreted. And it's incredibly difficult to interpret those tests to extract the metabolic component, so the component that can be addressed by diet. And so, well, you could start with vitamin D. So if the person's in Scotland, they're deficient. So just, you know, then just take supplements. And if they only want to do it for a few months or a few, you know, or a year or two, then you just take 5,000 IUs a day, and you can argue with your doctor in a decade whether you've been taking too much or not, because it would have been dangerous in that time. You could, as you well know, that the HbA1c is not very good, but if you could get a Kraft test, that would do. If you could measure insulin, or if you could do the sneaky thing and have a non-fasting blood insulin, your doctor might do that, so that you actually can figure out your 2-hour insulin response, because that gives you an idea. You know, if you've got a good 2-hour insulin response, your metabolic health isn't dreadful, and also if it's someone who's had a rough and tough life, then sort of liver function can be quite good, right? Just to know that your liver is really, really healthy, because if your liver's not healthy, it's not sufficient to say your liver's healthy, so you're fine, but it is sufficient to say your liver's not healthy, and therefore you're not fine. Okay, I think that way around works. So if you did have liver problems, that would be and I mean, why not kidney problems as well? But I think the problem is that a vast number of people will pass all those tests, apart from the vitamin D, with flying colours and not really be well at all. I mean, that's what Joseph Kraft said in his book, that, you know, with HbA1c, you've got a very small chance of actually picking out the diabetics using that.
HbA1c is definitely a pretty poor predictor of bad outcomes in diabetes. I mean, if you're at 14, then it's a pretty good predictor, but you don't want to be at 14. No. Yeah, I mean, my experience with that, my father got to the point where he had a critical limb ischemia, which is your circulation in your leg has gotten so poor that we're considering amputating it. And his doctor said, well, he's not diabetic, he's at 6.4%. Well, the diabetic definition is 6.5%. Okay, but you're about to you're thinking of cutting his leg off, right? So all those years, the doctor never mentioned to my father that he was, by Kraft's definition, a diabetic, because he was at 6.4, not 6.5. Right? It's, yeah, they're tough, but, you know, I'm being a little contrarian with my waist measurement thing. There are definitely things that you want to look at beyond that. I mean, you're not going to discover a vitamin D deficiency based on your belt buckle, but you know, then again, you know, if you don't need your belt buckle to tell you you're living in Glasgow either.
Exactly. Yeah, but I think, Ali, that it really goes really to the heart of this. That, you know, we're not doctors, right? None of us are MDs, and, you know, if we had to be telling people from a medical point of view what to do to get well, then that's the wrong job. That's not our job. I think the whole point behind this is that isn't the right approach. That you can for sure improve your chances in COVID by not having high blood sugar. You can, and having low blood insulin, right? You can for sure do that. And you do it works in more than one way. You have a better chance of fighting it off before you even know you've got it. And you have a better chance of having a less severe infection. when you do succumb to it. And I think that, so I think the low carb side will help you on all fronts. But I think that really, if you want to give yourself a good chance against not just this virus, but all viruses in the future, then I think the cutting down the linoleic acid, the seed oils is definitely the most important. And unfortunately, it can't be done overnight because your body stores linoleic acid. So even if you weren't to eat another ounce of it for the next several years, your body would still have plenty stored away.
Yeah, so that's I've been saying to people that if they want a direct, fight against the risks of COVID, something they can do, something tangible, is get out in the sun and stop eating things that are high in linoleic acid and eat something which is high in omega-3 fats for the next, few years, because they compete in the body, right, for usage. So, I mean, that's for me, that's the main thing. I suppose everyone wants a magic bullet or a pill, something they can add rather than something they have to take away. So, you might say veg oils and people think, oh, well, I don't really cook much with canola oil or whatever, so that's fine. Not really realizing that nuts are really high in it. Pork fat is really high in it. Chicken fat's high in it. Processed food of all varieties is rammed with it. So donuts, the sneaky bit of cake that they have a couple of times a week is probably making their cells swim in it. So that is a hard sell.
Sorry, when you're looking at this specifically, it's probably the most effective thing. That and a low carb diet, this is probably the most effective thing you can do. I mean, COVID kills you via, COVID is SARS-2. SARS kills you via what they call acute respiratory distress syndrome. And the connections between that and seed oils are so...
It's hand in glove, isn't it? It's hand in glove. And it's hand in glove. And you're just...
Well, seed oils will induce acute respiratory distress syndrome if they feed you enough of it. So shouldn't that be, one of the first things that you're getting rid of? I mean, especially, there's few things where there's such a clear mechanism in humans as seed oils and acute respiratory distress syndrome that I've seen.
And you're just putting the finishing touches to a blog post about this, aren't you?
Funny you should mention that. Yes, I am.
So you mentioned there that ARDS is the process by which SARS kills you, and ARDS can be induced by excess linoleic acid in the cells, right?
Yes, exactly. There's ARDS, it's probably important to know, since, we were discussing before, the ARDS is how SARS kills you, right? It's acute respiratory distress syndrome. When you hear about all the people who have to go on a respirator, they have to go on the respirator because they have ARDS. SARS isn't the only virus that will give this to you. Influenza will also give you ARDS, or a burn can give you ARDS, or, trauma can give you ARDS if you have enough cellular damage. But if they get you into the hospital and they have to put you onto a respirator, and they feed you seed oils at the same time, you have 7 times higher risk with seed oils versus not seed oils. So the one study I found that was testing this in humans in a trauma center, the difference was so dramatic that they had, over the 6 years that they did the study, that they cut the use of seed oil is down almost to nothing, because they, you know, I mean, 7 times greater incidence of something as serious as ARDS, which has a fatality rate of from 30 to 90%, that's a pretty dramatic finding for a medical study. And as they cut down the use of seed oils, they cut the mortality rate from 15% down to 3.8%. So that's a huge bonus. That was this, you know, so this is one of those things, this paper or this blog post that I'm writing is one of those things where this is kind of my area of expertise, and I wanted to see if there was anything useful in it. Because, you know, as you were saying earlier, Allie, you sound kind of dumb just saying the same thing for everything that comes along, whatever ails you. This is the right solution, right? But this is one of these cases where it's really just dramatic how much it's the right solution. I mean, in this, I'll just quote this in this paper, the incidence of late ARDS, which is ultimately what they're measuring and what kills you, among those exposed to a soybean-based total parenteral nutrition was 28.7%, compared with 3.9% among those not so exposed, right? So that's 7.4 times more likely to get ARDS if you are fed soybean oil, right? That's fairly dramatic. Now, the other interesting thing that I found when I was doing this research, in reading about the acute care of COVID-19 patients, one of the things that they are describing as surprising is how common cardiovascular manifestations and systemic clotting is. Ken's got a bit of a smile on his face over there. He knows exactly where I'm going with this. So it turns out that, and this is just as an aside, I'll say this is one of my frustrations with medical research, is it turns out that clotting and coronary failure as a symptoms of ARDS is not only a pretty old effect, but it's something where they know exactly how to induce it. It turns out that neutrophils, white blood cells, a type of white blood cell, when you have a lung infection, right, like coronavirus, or lung damage, like you can get from a burn, you know, the white blood cells come into your cell and they do what's called a respiratory burst, which is they put out superoxide and toxins. One of the toxins that they put out is called Luca Toxin. Luca Toxin is made via 2 steps from linoleic acid, the fat and seed oils. Luca Toxin is so toxic that it will kill animals in minutes or hours, depending on the dose you give it. And one of the symptoms of Luca Toxin is clotting and cardiac failure. So they gave Luca Toxin to dogs. The dogs died of massive clots and cardiac failure in 2 hours. Now it gets into a really interesting point, right? So we know now that feeding seed oils to humans who are on respirators will give them ARDS. And we know that neutrophils that are reacting to lung damage will use the main fat in seed oils to basically, you know, I mean, they're doing this, of course, to fight off bacterial infections, but one begins to wonder, in vitro, neutrophils will use all of the seed oils that you give them to make this toxin, right, as fast as they can. If you're on a diet where you have, you know, several times the evolutionary appropriate level of this fat, and your neutrophils are going to use all of it that they can get to make this toxin, couldn't that explain a good piece of why people are getting so sick, and especially the people who have the seed oil associated conditions like metabolic syndrome, obesity, and diabetes, why they're the ones who have the worst reactions here? One would expect that they would be the most susceptible to it. And in a rat model, when they put them on a high-fat, high seed oil diet and then tried to induce ARDS, the ones with the higher linoleic acid content in their diet were also the ones that were most likely to die. So it's interesting. I mean, it's, like a lot of medical research, it's frustrating, but because, they can't do good human-based research on a topic like this, right? The paper that I found looking at seed oils and ARDS was taking a standard protocol that I guess somebody figured out, hey, every time we give somebody this soybean-based infusion, they get ARDS, let's measure it and see what happens. It's interesting because when one goes then and looks at the COVID-19 protocols, one of the things that they recommend against doing is TPN, because I guess they're starting to figure out that putting somebody on an incubator and giving them seed oils is a really bad combination. Even in the guidelines, if you look at it, they've now started recommending against giving people these seed oil infusions because they've come to the conclusion that they're just systematically bad for people. So
it's progress.
It's progress.
It's not quite reached the point of people joining up the dots, has it? So,
No.
Even doctors who recognize this correlation and stop doing that type of feeding during intubation, it's not probably translating to them telling all their friends, family, and patients to stop eating seed oils and nuts.
Well,
No.
the problem is the guidelines make you want to pound your head against the table, because what the guideline says, so the guideline formally recommended fish oil, right? Saying it's got a better immune profile, and there are studies in ARDS where it looks like fish oil is much better for you if you're on ARDS. But then they retracted that advice to use fish oil. And they have this rather obtuse explanation of why they did this. But when you dig down into it, essentially they realize that fish oil may not actually be good for you, right? It may be worse than some other alternatives, but it's so much better for you than the soybean alternative that it looks like it's good for you, right? So, but then when you go through the guidelines to the point where they recommend what you should feed these people, they say, well, you have to feed them the soybean oil because there's nothing else on the market in the United States. And if there was anything else, we would recommend you use that instead. So the doctors are doing what the guidelines tell them to do. I mean, but the guidelines are doing this in this backhanded way where, soybean oil is better than dying immediately, so give them that. But it's obviously harmful, and we wouldn't recommend it if there was anything else you could give them. Frustrating.
I think it's worth reiterating that if you look at, I found this paper on H1N1 flu, ARDS resulting from that 2016 paper. So COVID was a distant dream on the horizon. And it's identical. Every single word that Tucker said applied in that paper. The whole story, what the neutrophils do, how they do it, all the chemicals that are involved, it's exactly the same. The virus may be novel, but the process is not in the slightest novel. The clotting, and yet how often do you read in the last few weeks about this strange new disease with these strange new clotting symptoms and so on, as if nobody knew anything about it.
Yeah, don't these people read the research? I can read it. You can read it.
It's not that hard. There does seem to be a particular bias against studying coronaviruses at all, even post-SARS, which struck me as rather odd, because, there seems to be I found this paper related to the one I mentioned earlier, where they had surveyed all the viruses in Glasgow, and it was a different paper, but they said we've investigated that type and the influenza A and the influenza B and the RSV and the Parva and all the other viruses. The only one they didn't even list was the coronavirus. It wasn't even worth writing the name out in the paper. And I'm not quite sure why that is. People will study rhinoviruses, which are a little bit more milder,
sexy.
typically, but they won't study coronaviruses and then pretend that when a new coronavirus comes along that it's completely different from anything that's gone before.
Well, of course, that will sell newspapers. That will sell advertising space, which has been a huge factor in all this. For a dying legacy media, like the old newspapers have mostly gone online, and TV news. This has been grist to the mill, hasn't it?
Yeah.
Which is really upsetting because it's rank opportunism, and I hope it results in them dying faster.
I hope so. Especially one of the things that really personally has upset me. I have a relation in a care home, and she's got very slight dementia, but pretty much okay. But she gets extremely stressed. Her occupation was reading newspapers, and they had to stop her reading newspapers because she was getting so stressed and frightened by all this COVID stuff that she was causing a disturbance, shouting and so on. And I thought, that was an isolated circumstance. But I've heard since that it's now routine for televisions to be switched off in care homes because there's so much upset caused when news comes on that it's intolerable. And I've heard probably half a dozen different reports or references to that kind of thing happening, and that's horrendous. The situation in which you deliberately induce fear like that when it's clearly against the common good is incorrect. Although I have to say that I was horrified to read that the advice from the human behavior group of SAGE, so the government advisors to the government, was that you really have to scale the public if you want them to do what you want and make good use of the mainstream media to do so.
Well, that's what that's his entire career.
Yeah. But not only that, there were advisors who were advising the government to take that message and to make sure that it was sufficiently scary. And they way overshot. They so far overshot. So they kept junior schools, primary schools open for care workers, families to go to, and they expected, I believe, something like 20% occupancy of the schools, and it was more like 2% because everyone was so scared they wouldn't let their children go to the school, even when they were eligible to send the children there.
And the point about the economic side on the other side of this, and actually picking up on what you said, Tucker, about how this is Neil Ferguson's career. I don't know much beyond what he's been in the press before for, but when bird flu was out, he predicted that it might kill 150
million people.
So he's got form, and there's some very funny stuff going on about his code.
Yeah. No, it was foot and mouth disease, I heard, in the United States. They wound up killing 6 million cows because of some ridiculous prediction that he made that never came anywhere close to being true. Thank God that, I'm shocked he hasn't recommended that many people be killed to prevent the spread of coronavirus.
Yeah, it's not good. But the economic side about confidence and fear, tourism is people are going to some reasonable portion of the population are going to always just be scared now of going to a restaurant, of flying, of going to another country, and that's a great shame.
Mm-hmm.
Right. One other thing I would like to mention since I actually found something that might be useful treatment for this, so I think I should probably mention that and mention the pathway. quickly. Ken knows that one of my favorite topics is oxidized LDL, and therefore by extension oxidized phospholipids. This is one of the rare things where there's a clear pathway in the medical literature from excess seed oil consumption to oxidized phospholipids. Even in humans, they've demonstrated that if you eat too many seed oils, it will make your phospholipids more prone to oxidation. Well, they did a little bit of work. Here's a paragraph for you. Modulation of this injury pathway, therefore, could be utilized to protect patients infected with H5N1 avian influenza virus, SARS coronavirus, anthrax, or other as yet unknown lethal lung pathogens, any of those around, from developing acute severe lung failure. So it turns out that if your phospholipids, if the omega-6 fats in your phospholipids get oxidized, that is a signature of infection to your body. And that causes, you may have heard the cytokine storm that people with coronavirus get. So it turns out this is the innate immune system, right? They used a TLR4 blocker. TLR is a part of the innate immune system that basically detects if you have pathogens in your body. And they used a mouse model of influenza-infected mice and found, they describe, thus this drug is called eritorin. Eritorin treatment of influenza-infected mice not only blocks the cytokine storm exacerbated by influenza-induced endogenous TLR4 agonists like oxidized phospholipids, but also inhibits the production and accumulation of certain oxidized phospholipids in infected lungs, including OX-PAPC and possibly others. This is a drug that's been tested in humans that is directly working on this pathway of oxidized seed oils worsening the immune response in infectious diseases. And as Ken mentioned, when you get to a certain point, the progress, the pathological progress of the body's deleterious response to these pathogens is the same with influenza and with SARS coronavirus. This is something that people should really be looking into, and I haven't heard a peep about it from anybody anywhere. So if there are any physicians out there, please, guys, start looking at this stuff.
Yeah, well, I mean, it gives people who are listening at least another clear reason to ruthlessly cut out any sources of linoleic acid where they can. And
I think it's probably, I mean, it's easy to give a very pessimistic, but even though that was optimistic, if you can get the drug, it's easy to have a slightly pessimistic viewpoint because we're talking about the death and the ARDS and so on, and it's all pretty horrible. But you know, even when people get exposed, and most people don't even know they've ever been exposed, and of the people who develop any symptoms whatsoever, almost all are very mild. And of the people who develop more severe symptoms, most recover just fine at home. And you know, it is something like 0.2% of people who are ending up with the very most serious disease, and some large fraction of that dying. But that has to be, it could be an extreme of age, or it could be an extreme of poor metabolic health, but it's not most people, right? And so if people can make even small steps in the right direction, there's got to be a chance that the next time something like this comes along, it'll be not as bad as it otherwise would have been, right? You don't have to reach perfection in metabolic health to substantially improve your chances.
Yeah, that's a really good message, I think, because some people kind of think about improving what they eat and feel overwhelmed by the idea that they have to do everything all at once, and it just means chicken breast and lettuce without any dressing. It's remarkable, seeing some posts in low carb community forums where they're saying, I've been doing low carb for weeks and I hate it. And then they say, well, what are you eating? And they say, well, I have a very small bowl of porridge in the morning and I'm doing 1,200 calories a day. And, the messaging around nutrition is so garbled in the world that it's a wonder anyone gets to the right information in the first place. But I guess that's all you can do is keep telling people what you found, and some will listen, and it'll snowball. I think that there's another point of optimism is doctors are catching on to this. The public health collaboration in the UK is growing all the time, and there's a growing community in the States as well.
The CEO of the American Diabetes Association is a type 2 diabetic who manages her disease through a low-carb diet.
That was huge.
Excellent. That's just wonderful. Yeah.
And I don't know, for all of the fussing about RCTs that one hears from the evidence-based, I'll put that in scare quotes, evidence-based medicine community, the ADA changed their recommendations on low-carb diets to be pro-low-carb diets based on the Virtus study, which was not a randomized controlled trial, but had such a dramatically positive impact on patients that they just literally couldn't continue to ignore it after having been ignoring it for the better part of 100 years.
Yeah, and David Unwin's cohort has got a lot of clout as well. It's hard to argue with.
Success. You can't argue with success.
Yeah. No, I was.
They'll do their best, but it's hard to argue with it.
Yeah. No, I thought the PHC conference a few weeks ago was fantastic, and I think that the thing that was particularly good about it, apart from particular cooking demonstrations and things like that, the thing that was particularly good about it was the range of very accessible talks. I think. There was probably something for everyone, and there were lots of really practical, if you're in this situation, what do you do, what can you do, where can you get help, who can you contact, sort of information. And I think that if people are feeling a bit lost, especially in the UK, that finding those YouTube videos would probably be a good move.
Yeah, I agree, and I think we've taken up a fair bit of time already, and we don't have to go into this in depth. So if you don't want to say much on it, then maybe you could say where would be like a one-stop shop to get the information. But I'm sure we're all agreed that very early on in lockdown, it was easy to see that compared to, sensible hygiene recommendations and social distancing for those most at risk, compared to lockdown was on balance more damaging than helpful. But when do you think that was very clear? And if you don't want to go into it too much, as I say, just recommend somewhere where people can look for that information.
Well, there was no evidence. There's never been any evidence that it's ineffective compared to anything else or on its own, right? Even going back to the data that came out of the 1918 influenza epidemic.
And this is what's so hard for people to get their heads around, because they think, come on, it just has to be effective.
It makes sense that it would be effective until you start looking at the specific aspects of coronavirus, right? The biggest problem let's say Ebola. I would think lockdown is super effective for a disease like Ebola. Ebola is not very contagious. It's generally pretty obvious that somebody's got Ebola, right? It doesn't have this sort of period, this long period where you're asymptomatic and you can go around infecting lots of people, right? I mean, if you read the World Health Organization's recommendations on how to deal with an influenza epidemic, and influenza is the most similar disease to coronavirus, even from their recommendations from last year or the year before, they say lockdown's not an effective strategy. And why is it not effective? Because it spread so fast, right? It got out of the attempt to contain it in China. It got into countries like Italy. It spread around Italy before they had any idea that it was there. By the time they tried to infect it, it was already, you know, epidemic in the country. If you look at what happened in the cruise ship, the Diamond Princess, or the Princess Diamond, whatever it was, they locked everybody into their rooms, good, and then they had infected staffers feeding them, right, which was a very effective way of spreading the virus around the ship. Lock people into an enclosed space, have somebody who's infected with a respiratory virus come to their space and breathe on them. And, you know, even then they only got, you know, 20% infection rate. But if you look at the, you know, compare the cruise ship to a nursing home, it's almost exactly the same situation. In the United States, 43% of the coronavirus deaths have been in the 0.6% of the population in nursing homes, right? Which makes sense, because with a highly infectious respiratory virus, if you want to spread it amongst people, you put them into an enclosed space and then have carriers go visit them all every day. Perfect. Just exactly how you would want to do it. Worked like a charm in the cruise ship, and it worked like a charm in the nursing homes. What doesn't make sense is taking non-infected people at low susceptibility of having an adverse outcome from this disease and locking them down, right? I mean, you know, the nursing home case, in my mind, is a perfect example of how everything they tried to do with this disease was the worst possible thing that they could have done. Because here you have a controlled environment. They could lock down the facility very easily. They typically do it every flu season, from what I understand. You know, they test and make sure that people who are coming in or don't have a fever, and they have a trained staff. And they had a complete failure at their ability to constrain this disease in an area where, if lockdown was going to work, it should have worked in a nursing home. There's no better place for a lockdown to work than in a nursing home that I could think of.
Yeah, I mean, one of the most disturbing aspects of this whole phenomenon is that people have refused to look at what's in front of their eyes. So the Diamond Princess was some time ago, and you know, anyone who saw that, it was trying to predict spread in countries, should have, you know, paused for thoughts about whether their favorite model would have worked on in that environment. And then there was a few weeks later the Theodore Roosevelt warship aircraft carrier, which had very similar statistics, except because it's a much younger population, there was only one fatality, but it was 20%, under 20% got infected in a situation where there's a million people living per square mile, which, you know, suggests that the population density, although it's much discussed, is not the be all and end all of this. And I think that's going back to your question, Ali, that when was it obvious that things were not as they were being told with regard to lockdown? And the answer, the same as Tucker's, always just became more and more obvious with time. It didn't look right at the beginning. I talked with someone who had experience of pre-polio vaccine polio here in Scotland, and they had polio go round several times when they were a school child, and they had dedicated isolation hospitals where people suspected of polio would be taken off and isolated and treated. And they couldn't remember a single case of spread inside a school class because there was a plan, and they stuck to the plan, and the plan was soundly based on science. And the polio virus is quite infectious and about the same sort of fatality rate as COVID and so forth. So it's actually quite a good analogy. It's a bit more infectious, but not much more.
Yeah, here's a paper I found from the Journal of School Health in 1951. They say, Anderson and Arnstein in Communicable Disease Control, which I gather is a textbook in 1948, in discussing polio, say, quote, school closure, as well as closure of moving picture theaters, Sunday schools, and other similar groups, is frequently attempted in response to popular demand that, quote, something be done. Although tried repeatedly, it is of no proved value, never altering the usual curve of the epidemic, nor has the disease been more prevalent or persistent in those communities with the courage to resist those demands. Same thing they found in 1918 influenza. The military then and the military now have been totally unable to use quarantine to stop respiratory diseases, right? I mean, the aircraft carrier Theodore Roosevelt is a perfect example. This is a ship in the middle of the ocean somewhere, right? If any place is under quarantine, it's that. So what happened? Well, they have to eat. They got infected by just like the guy in the nursing home, he got infected when somebody brought him food. That's what happened to this aircraft carrier. You can't have an effective quarantine when people are going to the supermarket every couple of days. You just can't. And to their credit, in China, when they quarantined everybody, they quarantined them from the food too. They wouldn't let them go to the supermarket, and they got really hungry and unhappy.
Yeah, but I think the Theodore Roosevelt's a really good example, because that was 15 days, right? The whole thing was 15 days from the point of infection to everyone who had been infected was infected. And the 800 or whatever whoever got infected, all happened in 15 days. So it's really easily recorded and understood. And you could say, well, that's an incredible rate of growth, infection in that case. Why was it so fast? I don't know. But we're only talking about that one because that happened there. It didn't happen in every aircraft carrier, right?
Right.
It doesn't happen in every nursing home. In fact, it probably happens in a minority of nursing homes. There are a lot of people in nursing homes. And so it's not that the disease always spreads in this very obvious way where you can't miss it. The problem is a lot of the time it spreads people who have almost no symptoms, spreading it slowly around in the background in the population. And so when, and this is in this Ioannidis paper that's I think it's not been published yet, but there's a preprint where he looked at all the seroprevalence results from many of the seroprevalence results from countries over the period. And by chance, there was one done in Scotland, blood donors in Scotland, a day either side of the lockdown date. And so it was a 3-day study of about 500 people, and there was around about 1% when you do the corrections and so forth, infected. Now, this is among people who ticked the box to say they've not been ill in the last 2 weeks, right? They're going to give blood, and they, they didn't know they had COVID or had COVID, and they had antibodies at the level of about 1%, which I think when you apply the numbers to the UK, it was about 700,000 or in that ballpark people in the UK. And that's probably an underestimate, because London was almost certainly way worse than bits of Fife and Angus and so forth, where the blood donors were. So if you take 780,000 people, say, and you distribute them around the country and then lock everyone else in the same place as them, it's not going to work.
Right.
You don't in the slightest change the course of the disease. You don't make it. I frequently say that also the week, because we knew lockdown was coming, everyone behaved in this, the most bizarre behavior I've ever seen, which was as many people as could physically fit in any shop went into those shops and took out as much as they could carry. And that was at a time when there were hundreds of thousands of infected people in the UK. And you can look for that signal, or presumably a huge boost in numbers when people anti-lockdown, or whatever the word is. And then a couple of weeks later, they were all locked down, and you can look for the big drop, but you won't find it. There's hardly a hint of the numbers going up. I mean, I'm not saying there isn't one, but I wouldn't be able to convince myself that there was one. And you don't see a downturn a few weeks later, whether you look at cases or deaths or whatever. There just isn't a sign. It was, as you said, Tucker, in the first of these, that you have this natural growth behavior, which right from the beginning is not exponential growth, but is falling below exponential and falls further and further behind as time goes on. And you can take mathematical models that certainly don't take thousands of lines of code and just have 3 parameters in them, and you could almost perfectly fit what happens in Sweden. And you can take the same parameters and almost with a slightly different start date and obviously population size, and fit Germany, Italy, and UK,
and every other. There's Isaac Ben Israel, who's an Israeli math professor, did that and said, "Look, it basically." I mean, I've seen a guy post on Twitter the formula.
Yeah.
Pretty well almost every place. And I mean, I don't know. I feel a little vindicated because I did that Italian. I looked at the Italian data and I said, look, if the goal here is to flatten the curve with an intervention called a lockdown, in Italy, the curve started flattening well before the lockdown policy was implemented. Okay. Mm-hmm. And I feel completely vindicated now that the health minister of Norway has come out and said, if we do this again, we don't need to do a lockdown. The curve started flattening before we implemented the lockdown, and the PM of Norway has now come out and said, I only did the lockdown because I panicked. And that's really what it comes down to. It's
similar in Denmark, right? It's when
I haven't seen the Denmark thing. I've been working on this blog post for you two gentlemen.
Well, it's a bit, Denmark were a bit less honourable. I think Norway, you have to give them massive credit for coming out and admitting that that's what happened, that it was a panic, and that they were scared in the moment, however bad that looks on them. But Denmark, it's a leaked paper that shows, or leaked emails, I think, that show that the scientific recommendations to the government were not exclusively lockdown. That was one of a suite of options. And the politicians were actually encouraging massaging of figures or changing of figures to make it look like lockdown was warranted.
Really? Oh, that's damning. I know here in the United States, New York, which is pretty much, I guess, at this point had the worst experience of anybody. The governor has come out and admitted that he kind of panicked into it and that it just didn't make any sense, and also observed that all the predictive models were just completely wrong, which is pretty much obvious to anybody who spends more than a couple of minutes looking at them. Yeah, it's frustrating.
You think things like the Salem witch trials were left behind?
Human nature's not been left behind. And unfortunately, I mean, as a history student and a student of the ups and downs of Wall Street and Wall Street risk management, this is certainly the biggest worldwide panic in history, both in terms of the number of people involved and the percentage of the population involved. But it's not, it's hard to say why this happened. I think a lot of it is just because we live in such wealthy countries that we can afford, or at least we thought we could afford to do this. People genuinely, I see these signs when I drive around where I live, which is in one of the quote unquote hot zones in the United States. And people say, thank you all. Thank you, essential workers. And really every worker's an essential worker. I mean, everybody who has a job that they use to feed their family has got an essential job. And I think, there's way too many people who think that it was, in some way it's okay to put 40 million people out of work to, protect a couple tens of thousands of people potentially. It's an enormous cost we're paying for this. And I mean, hopefully, as I said earlier, we'll bounce back from it pretty quickly, but there are a lot of people who are not going to recover. There's, suicides are going to go up, businesses are going to fail, people who thought they had their retirement in the bag are going to discover they're going to be scraping by for the rest of their lives. This has just been an enormous, and the evidence for this just didn't support the cost.
No, and it was never going to. And that's the sad thing. It was, as you say, it was a panic. The people must have been aware of what they were paying for what they were buying. Maybe not precisely, but must have had the idea that they were paying a lot for buying, not having at very best, not having the hospitals overfull for too long.
Yeah. Well, and that's of course the most ironic part of this whole thing is that in the United States, the part of the economy that's paying the biggest price for the lockdown is the healthcare sector. Nurses being laid off. I know a local hospital just laid off a huge portion of their nursing staff. Doctors are being laid off and having their, salaries cut back because they're not doing any profitable procedures. In the majority of hospitals in the United States, the effort to cut back on workload to make way for this imaginary coronavirus epidemic left lots of medical professionals just sitting around twiddling their thumbs. And now a hospital's a business. Even a not-for-profit hospital is a business. It's got to, at the end of the year, if it keeps losing money forever, even in the UK with the NHS, they've got to balance the books at the end of the year, or at the end of some year.
Yeah. No, it's shocking here what hasn't continued. There's almost no routine medical care has continued. I've even heard of people with brain tumors whose operations have been cancelled. With astrocytomas and things like that, where every day makes a difference, never mind a week or two.
And that's a death sentence if you don't get that procedure.
Yeah, it's just terrible.
Yeah.
And I found out earlier today that the vitamin B12 injections had also been stopped. So if anyone needs vitamin B12, they haven't been getting them for going on 3 months now. That's
what I hope is that
easy.
we can get that information to as many people as possible, and that we can see that information being disseminated more. There's been widely circulated articles in Telegraph, the New York Times, BBC, which are critical of lockdown, and most of them don't go as far as we have, but I think they're coming. And I think what I thought would never come out is being more widely accepted by people, and hopefully there's more bounce back in the economy than the worst predictions. And certainly at the very least, I hope it highlights how metabolic health isn't just about it's not at all about fat shaming or anything like that. It's really about improving your life so that you can live a better one for longer.
Yeah, absolutely. The whole point is to be healthy. The cosmetic effects are just a side effect, a welcome side effect, but just a side effect.
Yeah, here's to that. All right. Well, I really appreciate you both coming on again. I'll put your Twitter handles in the show notes and the link to the blog post, Tucker. And if you just say what your Twitter handles are, we can sign off.
I'm at Tucker Goodrich, and there's in my Twitter profile is a link to my blog,
which is going to have a great article to read very soon, I hear. And I'm Ken__strain on Twitter, which is well hidden.
Perfect. All right, nice one. Well, thanks again, guys, and I'll speak to you soon.
Thank you for having me back, Ali. Thanks, you for having both of us back.
Good to see you both.